Imagine a world where the most powerful family on earth, surrounded by glittering jewels, golden halls, and armies at their command, refused to touch something as simple as soap and water. While peasants scrubbed themselves in rivers and common folk fought disease with crude remedies, this royal family declared that bathing was dangerous, even sinful. Behind the polished crowns and velvet robes hid layers of filth, perfumes masking decay, and a stench that even courtiers whispered about in secret. Yet, in their minds, it was all a symbol of purity and power. How could the rulers of nations who dictated the fate of millions believe that cleansing themselves was a threat to their health? And what would happen when their secret, their smell, and their shame became impossible to hide? This is the bizarre and tragic story of the royal family who banned bathing altogether. When we think of royalty, images of shimmering crowns, gleaming palaces, and lavish banquets instantly come to mind. Kings and queens are often remembered for their opulence, their elegance, and the carefully cultivated image of divine superiority they projected over their subjects. Yet, behind the magnificent draperies and polished silverware, there existed a bizarre and unsettling truth. In certain royal households, bathing, the very act of cleansing oneself with water, was considered taboo. Not just discouraged, but actively banned. To understand how such an extraordinary belief could take root, we must first step back in time to an era when medicine was riddled with superstition, when the invisible world of germs and bacteria was still centuries away from discovery. In medieval and early modern Europe, people were constantly seeking explanations for the plagues and diseases that swept through cities with merciless force. Entire populations were decimated by outbreaks of the Black Death, smallpox, and cholera, leaving survivors desperate for answers. And in the absence of scientific knowledge, fear often guided custom. It was within this backdrop that some members of the royal family came to believe that water itself was dangerous. The reasoning may sound absurd to us today, but at the time it carried a kind of twisted logic. Physicians of the era often taught that hot water opened the pores of the skin, creating vulnerable gateways through which deadly diseases could slip inside the body. Bathing, they argued, did not wash away sickness, but instead invited it in. To immerse oneself in water was, in their view, to welcome death. And so, while peasants continued to bathe in rivers and streams, hoping at least to wash away the grime of daily labor, royals began to view water with suspicion. Instead of bathing, they doused themselves in perfumes, oils, and powders. Elaborate wardrobes of silk and velvet were used to hide stains and absorb sweat. What might strike us today as filth, they disguised as fashion. And because they were the ruling class, their strange practices carried the weight of authority. One of the earliest and most striking examples of this belief took hold in the French court. By the time of the Renaissance, French royalty had convinced themselves that bathing could weaken the body, damage fertility, and even lead to madness. Successive monarchs grew up in this culture, and so the tradition of avoiding baths passed from generation to generation like a twisted inheritance. But it wasn't just France. Across Europe, there were whispers of noble families who clung to the same fear. In Spain, Italy, and parts of England, bathing became associated not with cleanliness, but with sin. Public bathhouses, once popular, were shut down under suspicion of spreading disease and immorality. To be seen washing oneself regularly was not only strange but dangerous, an indulgence that risked both the body and the soul. Among royals, this idea transformed into something even more powerful. To abstain from bathing was not merely a precaution. It became a marker of refinement, a symbol that one did not belong to the sweaty, dirty masses. After all, royalty did not labor in the fields or work in the streets. They were above the grime of common life. And so, their refusal to bathe was framed as proof of superiority, an ironic twist, since in reality, it often made them far dirtier than their subjects. Yet this bizarre stance raised a troubling question. How did those closest to the royals endure it? Courtiers, advisors, and servants worked in close quarters with kings and queens who rarely, if ever, touched water. Diaries and letters from the period give us hints. Courtiers often wrote in veiled language about strong perfumes that filled the air of royal chambers, or about the overwhelming presence of oils and powders on garments. Behind these polite words lay an obvious truth. The royals reeked. Their bodies, layered with sweat, grease, and unwashed fabric, emitted odors that perfumes could never fully conceal. Still, no one dared to openly challenge the practice. To criticize a king's personal habits was to risk one's life, and so whispers were kept quiet, masked with polite flattery. The royal family's refusal to bathe became both an open secret and an untouchable subject. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this story is how the royals themselves viewed their condition. They did not see themselves as dirty or unhealthy. Quite the opposite, they believed they were protecting their health, preserving their strength, and demonstrating moral superiority. To bathe, in their eyes, was to stoop to the level of commoners, to risk exposure to deadly illness, and to abandon centuries of tradition. And so, the cycle continued. New kings inherited the same teachings from their predecessors, passing on the belief that water was not a source of life, but a carrier of death. This belief shaped not only their private lives, but also their public image, influencing how courts were run, how clothing was designed, and even how medical advice was given. But as the years turned into decades, the consequences of this decision began to show. Behind the velvet curtains and gilded thrones, the bodies of royalty began to betray them. Skin infections, parasites, and rotting teeth became commonplace, even among the most powerful rulers in Europe. While they thought they were protecting themselves from disease, their refusal to wash often made them more vulnerable. In the next part of this story, we will move beyond the roots of this strange custom and into its darker consequences, the scandals, the ridicule, and the ways in which the world outside the palace walls began to take notice. For though they wore crowns and wielded armies, not even kings could hide the smell of a body unwashed. By the time the belief against bathing had been firmly entrenched in royal life, the consequences began to spill beyond the private chambers of the monarchy. What began as a superstition born of fear soon became a source of scandal, shame, and even political ridicule. Imagine the royal courts of Europe, glittering halls filled with courtiers, ambassadors, foreign dignitaries, and noble guests from across the continent. These visitors often arrived with expectations of grandeur, hoping to be dazzled by the splendor of kings and queens. And indeed, at first glance, the spectacle rarely disappointed. Ornate chandeliers sparkled above marble floors, music filled the halls, and tables overflowed with exotic foods. But as guests spent more time in these spaces, the truth became unavoidable. Behind the silk curtains and perfumed air, there lingered a stench that no palace could conceal. The royals, cloaked in velvet and drenched in heavy fragrances, were essentially living in layers of filth. Clothes were often worn until they stiffened with dirt, sweat, and oils. Fabrics were rarely washed. Instead, they were brushed down or layered with powders to mask the grime. Underneath, the skin festered with rashes, lice, and sores. For some royals, the mere act of changing undergarments was considered sufficient cleansing. One French queen proudly remarked that she changed her linen twice a day and believed it made her cleaner than anyone who bathed in water. To her, fabric alone was enough to absorb impurities from the body. But such practices came at a cost. Doctors of the time, still clinging to outdated theories, often misdiagnosed illnesses that were aggravated by lack of hygiene. Skin infections spread unchecked. Dental disease rotted teeth until jaws swelled with abscesses, and parasites thrived in the damp, unwashed folds of clothing. These ailments were often hidden under layers of clothing and powder, but those close to the royals could not escape their reality. Servants, who dressed and undressed them, wrote accounts of sores, ulcers, and infestations that would have horrified the outside world. Beyond health, there were also deeper consequences to reputation. By the 17th and 18th centuries, as the Enlightenment dawned across Europe, scientific understanding began to evolve. Slowly, physicians started to recognize the importance of cleanliness. Cities that had once shut down public bathhouses began experimenting with new forms of sanitation. The wider population, though still plagued by disease, was beginning to see washing as a path toward health rather than a threat. This shift in perception meant that the royal family's old customs no longer seemed like wisdom but like foolishness. Foreign dignitaries whispered about the odor of kings and queens, mocking them behind closed doors. Ambassadors from cultures that prized bathing, such as the Ottoman Empire, were particularly disgusted. For them, daily washing was not only a matter of hygiene, but also of honor and religious duty. To enter the French or Spanish courts, where monarchs wore perfumes to mask years without bathing, was to step into a paradox. Rulers who demanded respect but could not respect themselves enough to wash. One of the most infamous stories comes from the reign of King Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King. Though he projected an image of divine magnificence, he reportedly bathed only a handful of times in his entire life. Doctors advised him against it, warning of the dangers of water. Instead, he relied on perfumes and the constant changing of undergarments. The result was that his court, though dazzling in fashion, was often described by visitors as reeking of overpowering scents, a desperate attempt to bury what lay beneath. And Louis XIV was not alone. His contemporaries across Europe adopted similar habits. In Spain, Queen Isabella famously declared that she had only bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. In England, members of the Tudor dynasty were known for their occasional dry washes, where their bodies were rubbed with cloths and scented oils rather than water. These accounts, repeated and exaggerated by critics, cemented an image of royalty that was both majestic and grotesque. For their subjects, the irony was bitter. Peasants, who had far less wealth and access to resources, often washed more frequently than their monarchs. Rivers and streams, though polluted, still provided some opportunity for cleansing. When word spread of royal habits, it did not always inspire reverence. It sometimes inspired ridicule. Pamphlets and gossip circulated mocking the filth of kings, painting them as hypocrites who demanded loyalty while failing to uphold even the most basic standards of decency. Yet within the walls of the palace, this culture was fiercely protected. To question the practice was to question centuries of royal authority, and that was no small matter. Physicians who dared to suggest bathing as a remedy often found themselves dismissed or ignored. Servants who complained about the odors of their masters faced punishment or dismissal. And so the cycle persisted, layer upon layer of perfume, garment after garment of soiled linen, and an unshakable belief that water was the true enemy. The consequences were not just personal but political. As alliances formed and nations vied for dominance, the perception of a ruler's character often influenced diplomacy. To be known as filthy, diseased, or ignorant of basic hygiene could undermine a monarch's dignity in the eyes of rivals. While power and armies could still command respect, the whispers of filth lingered in the shadows, tarnishing reputations in ways that no crown could shield. As centuries turned and knowledge advanced, the world outside the palace walls began to change. Soap making became more sophisticated, and public health movements slowly grew. But within royal households that clung to tradition, bathing remained rare, even forbidden. It was not until the pressures of modernity, science, and scandal forced change that these habits began to crack. And it was in those cracks, in the exposure of filth, in the ridicule of subjects, and in the growing disgust of allies that the legacy of the royal family who banned bathing began to take on its tragic shape. In the final part of this story, we will witness the downfall of this strange tradition, the moment when the illusion could no longer hold, and the legacy it left behind, a reminder that even the most powerful are not immune to the weight of superstition, nor to the judgment of history. As centuries passed, the world outside the palace walls began to shift in ways that royalty could no longer ignore. Science was advancing, medicine was evolving, and the veil of superstition was slowly lifting. What had once been considered dangerous bathing was beginning to emerge as a mark of progress, modernity, and health. The stage was set for the downfall of one of the strangest royal traditions in history. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Age of Enlightenment had given Europe a new lens through which to see the world. Scientific inquiry challenged old beliefs, and physicians began to realize that water could cleanse rather than corrupt. The discovery of microbes and the link between cleanliness and disease transformed public health. What was once dismissed as peasant habit now became a cornerstone of modern medicine. Bathing was not a threat but a necessity. For the royal families who had long shunned water, this was a crisis of image. The very practices that had once symbolized their superiority now branded them as backward and ignorant. No longer did perfume-soaked garments and powder-dusted wigs hide their habits, they revealed them. To foreign ambassadors and increasingly skeptical subjects, the refusal to bathe was no longer an oddity. It was a scandal. Take the French court, for instance. By the late reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, whispers about filth had become one of many grievances leveled against the monarchy. While the public suffered in poverty, their rulers were seen as decadent, wasteful, and, to some, quite literally dirty. Pamphlets circulated mocking the royal family, portraying them not only as corrupt and aloof, but also as foul in body. In a climate where anger toward monarchy was already boiling, such caricatures only fanned the flames. Though their downfall was rooted in politics and economics, the image of the unwashed royal played no small role in making them seem unfit to rule. Meanwhile, across Europe, new generations of rulers began to reluctantly embrace the idea of hygiene. In England, Queen Victoria's reign saw a transformation in public health. Bathhouses, once vilified, reappeared in cities, and indoor plumbing became a symbol of modern living. Though even Victoria herself was not known for daily bathing, she and her successors could no longer afford to ignore the cultural tide. Cleanliness was now associated with respectability, morality, and progress. To remain unwashed was to risk ridicule and rejection. By the 19th century, even the French monarchy, though toppled and reshaped multiple times, found itself forced to abandon its disdain for water. Royal physicians could no longer defend superstition in the face of germ theory. Members of the aristocracy, desperate to appear enlightened, began to promote bathing as part of fashionable life. What had once been condemned as dangerous became embraced as sophisticated. The bathtub, once a suspicious object, was transformed into a symbol of luxury. And so, the tradition of banning bathing slowly crumbled under the weight of progress. But its legacy remained. The centuries of avoidance had left their mark not only on royal health, but on royal reputation. For generations, stories of unwashed kings and queens persisted, passed down as cautionary tales of ignorance and arrogance. To the common people, it became proof that power did not equal wisdom, that even those who wore crowns could be blinded by superstition. There was also a more symbolic consequence. By refusing to bathe, these monarchs had built an invisible wall between themselves and their subjects. They believed they were protecting themselves from disease, from impurity, from the grime of ordinary life. But in reality, they only highlighted how disconnected they were. The very people they ruled, peasants who washed in rivers and workers who scrubbed themselves after long days in fields, were, in many ways, cleaner than the kings and queens who looked down upon them. The tradition, meant to display superiority, instead revealed hypocrisy. Looking back, it is almost comical to imagine rulers drenched in perfume, powder, and silks, yet reeking beneath it all. But behind the humor lies a darker truth. Their refusal to bathe cost them not only dignity, but, at times, their health and legitimacy. Parasites spread unchecked, wounds festered, and reputations rotted. They believed themselves untouchable, but history would not allow them to hide. Today, we remember this odd chapter of history with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. In a world where daily showers and personal hygiene are seen as basic, it seems unthinkable that the most powerful people alive once feared water more than plague. But in many ways, it is a reminder of the fragility of power, of how tradition and superstition can cloud judgment, and of how even those who command nations can fall prey to ignorance. The downfall of the royal families who banned bathing altogether is not just the story of a strange habit. It is a reflection of a broader truth, that power without knowledge leads to downfall, that arrogance disguised as tradition can destroy reputations, and that no amount of gold or perfume can mask the rot beneath. So the next time you step into a shower, consider for a moment how far we've come. What we take for granted as a daily routine was once seen as a deadly risk, one that shaped the lives of kings and queens. And yet, it was their refusal to adapt, their stubbornness in the face of change, that turned them into symbols of ridicule. In the end, the history of these unwashed royals is not just about dirt, it is about the tragic collision of superstition, pride, and power. This is the bizarre and tragic legacy of the royal family who banned bathing altogether. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more deep dives into history's strangest secrets. Share this with a friend who loves bizarre stories from the past, and let us know in the comments, which part of this story shocked you the most?